Thursday, in part one of our Debt Rising series, we told you the deadline for Congress to raise the debt ceiling had come and gone Wednesday. But Treasury Department actions have delayed what it is expected to be another political standoff. In part two, we look at the consequences for continued inaction and what, if anything, can be done to fix the rising debt.
I am sending Congress a budget that rebuilds the military.
While his administration's budget reflects a scaling back of several agencies, President Trump, in his recent joint address to Congress, did not spend time detailing plans on how to manage the national debt, now creeping toward $20 trillion with a T, or how to reduce the annual deficits that add up to create that debt.
I'm worried that the problem is getting worse, both because we've waited too long to make changes, that the numbers continue to get worse, and the partisanship in this town is leading both parties to compete over who can be more fiscally irresponsible, and that's a very dangerous game.
All of this has real-world consequences on your wallet and the U.S. economy as a whole. Consider this: the government debt as a percentage of our gross domestic product in the U.S. is about 77%. Just 2 years ago, it was 73%. This is the apportioned debt economists say is held by the public, bought and sold on the open market that determines interest rates. By that measure, our debt is projected to rise to 89% of GDP within the decade. And by 2035, the Congressional Budget Office predicts it will rise to an all-time record of 106% of GDP, exceeding the all-time high set in World War II.
The debt limit does not authorize new spending commitments. It just allows the government to fund existing budget obligations that Congresses and presidents of both parties have already made. The Trump administration this week laid out its own ambitious agenda, its budget blueprint. On the campaign trail, it was a familiar refrain from both major candidates, Hillary Clinton and Donald Trump, promising their economic plans would not add to the national debt, raising eyebrows from skeptical economists. Think of it as a big cake. President Trump's ingredients likely will include a $4.5 trillion tax cut, a major infrastructure investment, along with deregulation, energy, and trade overhauls, all things he says will supercharge the U.S. economy. But tax experts predict to make that all happen will require trillions more in federal borrowing. And if true, our national debt cake will only add layers. Put another way, if the U.S. economy starts to cook, inflation would go up, and then interest rates would have to be raised as well. If interest rates rise just 1% more than current projections, the interest the U.S. pays on the current $20 trillion national debt would be $632 billion. That's $50 billion more than the current defense budget. Over 10 years, that 1% interest hike would make for a $1.6 trillion increase in what we pay out in interest on the national debt. Who holds our debt? The top holders are actually U.S. citizens and American entities such as state and local governments, pension funds, mutual funds, and the Federal Reserve. Together, they own 69%, or $13 trillion of the national debt. Foreign nations hold 31% of the total debt. Japan is now the largest foreign holder of debt with $1.1 trillion, followed closely by China with just more than $1 trillion. Trump aides acknowledge their budget will add short-term debt, but they say that's a good thing, arguing that spurring economic growth will produce more tax revenue to pay back the debt, the so-called supply-side argument. White House officials insist the nation's annual deficits and overall debt will remain, quote, manageable relative to the overall economy.
Much of the money is going into entitlement programs like Social Security and Medicare, and that means that we're not seeing investments in productive activity, which affects jobs and wages. I think there are huge consequences for Americans.
Some lawmakers argue for a dollar-for-dollar discipline, binding deficit reduction plans with any increase in the debt ceiling, while others on Capitol Hill say debt ceiling increases should be paired with overhauling Social Security and Medicare, programs that eat up the largest part of the federal budget.
A real program for reducing the long-run debt has to be bipartisan, and it has to be the kind of program where everybody gets a little bit hurt so that we stave off a much bigger catastrophe.